This is like encountering the sublime, and in effect that's what happens when you encounter Beethoven. Hello everyone and welcome to the Music Professor channel. My name's Matthew King and I'm here with Loki. We're going to be talking today about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, but in a really different way. And it's going to be an exciting video. It's all about, here's a thing to think about. The Fifth Symphony is incredibly familiar, far too familiar now. It's lost all its edge really. Everybody knows, you know, it's just a trope, it's a cliche, it's become a part of our culture. And it's hard. If you hear an amazing performance of the Fifth Symphony, you can, to some degree, recapture some of the electricity. I'm sure many of us have been at exciting performances where the music takes on some of the electrifying power that it must have had once upon a time. But can you imagine what it must have been like for the people who first heard the symphony, and how terrifying the music must have been and how outrageous it must have been? Today I'm going to talk about the great French composer Hector Berlioz and his encounter with Beethoven's extraordinary music in 1828 and his arguments with his teachers about Beethoven's music. So we're talking about professors at the Paris Conservatoire who not only disliked Beethoven's music but corrected it. And later on in the video we'll see how they corrected it, particularly a teacher of Berlioz called Fétis, and the fascinating conflict between Berlioz and Fetis over this correction. It's the second movement of Beethoven's Fifth, which Fetis attempted to correct. And that will be the topic of the second half of this video. So Beethoven all his life, I think, would have aligned himself broadly with the ideals of the French Revolution, absolutely. But he lived in Vienna, which was a very oppressive place, and you couldn't say these things out loud in public. You could, however, write a symphony that seemed to embody the values of the French Revolution, which is precisely what he did. And this is why Beethoven's music was so enormously important to the Romantic generation, to the next generation. So Hector Berlioz is perhaps the most striking of these composers, certainly early on in the 19th century. And in the 1820s, he heard Beethoven's symphonies. They were performed at the Paris Conservatoire. And this is at a period after, you know, Napoleon had been defeated in 1815, the monarchy had been brought back. France was really creaking under the return of the old order. They had a terrible king called Charles X who was very oppressive. And by the late 1820s, in other words, when the Beethoven symphonies were first performed in Paris, there was a real hunger for what Beethoven's music was saying. So let's crack on. I'm going to be reading from the memoir of Hector Berlioz, the wonderful, wonderful French Romantic composer, born in 1803. And I'm reading from his famous Memoirs, translated by David Cairns. So we're starting out with Berlioz's account of these absolutely astonishing performances of Beethoven's symphonies that occurred at the Paris Conservatoire when Berlioz was a student. And these really were astonishing because it was the first time a proper orchestra, professional orchestra with a proper professional conductor, performed the Beethoven symphonies as a series. First time it happened, never happened in Beethoven's lifetime. All Beethoven's symphonies in his lifetime were performed by these weird scratch orchestras that were basically thrown together for the occasion and played a very, very amateur, almost sight-read performances of the pieces. And I think you'd be shocked and appalled at how amateurish those performances were in Vienna. It wasn't until the French premieres in 1828 that you would have received performances that might be recognisable in a modern sense as decent performances. Certainly not up to the quality of modern performances, but still essentially polished, rehearsed, decent performances of Beethoven's symphonies. And the person responsible for these was a guy called Habeneck, and he put together these performances with the Conservatoire Concert Society in 1828. So I'm going to read Berlioz's account of this extraordinary occasion when Beethoven's symphonies were heard really for the first time in a professional context. And Berlioz says this: "Not the least of Habeneck's troubles was the steady undercurrent of opposition from French and Italian composers who regarded the whole idea with malicious and ill-concealed disapproval. They had no desire to see official homage paid to a German, whose works seemed to them misbegotten monstrosities." Berlioz now goes on to talk about his teacher, who's a guy called Leseuer, who encouraged him, wonderfully actually, because Berlioz's father wanted him to study medicine. He was a bit of a late developer, and it was Leseuer who encouraged him when he wrote his early Mass. His teacher, Leseuer, said, you know, you've got to stop thinking about this medicine nonsense. You're a composer of genius. He said that to him. So we owe a great deal to Leseuer. When the symphonies were put on, Berlioz had to cajole him into going to the performances. It says, "I kept on at him, solemnly pointing out that when something as important as this occurred in our art, a completely new style on an unprecedented scale, it was his duty to find out about it and judge for himself. And in the end, he yielded and let himself be dragged off to the conservatoire one day when the C minor symphony was being performed." So this is Beethoven 5. He wanted to give it an unbiased hearing without distractions of any kind, so he dismissed me and sat by himself at the back of one of the ground floor boxes among people he did not know. When it was over, I came down from the floor above, eager to know what effect this extraordinary work had had on him and what he thought of it. I found him in the corridor, striding along with flushed face. "Well, master," I said. "Oof! Let me get out. I must have some air. It's amazing, wonderful. I was so moved and disturbed that when I emerged from the box and attempted to put on my hat, I couldn't find my head. Now please leave me be, we'll meet tomorrow." Wonderful description of his teacher's immediate emotional reaction to this absolutely revolutionary music. Isn't it extraordinary to see a contemporary hearing Beethoven 5 for the first time? We don't have that experience anymore. Beethoven's 5 has become too familiar. In 1828, it was absolutely unfamiliar. I suppose if I play a moment from that performance, the wonderful and astonishing and avant-garde transition from the third movement to the fourth on the piano, maybe I can give an impression of how astonishing that might have been. the astonishing transition from the darkness at the end of the scherzo into the light, the revolutionary dawn, in fact, of the finale. And I played it in Liszt's arrangement. Sorry to break off right in the middle of the main tune. So back to Berlioz's account, he says, I was triumphant. The next day I hurried round to see him, to see Leseuer, his teacher, who was so overwhelmed by that performance. The conversation at once turned to the masterpiece which had stirred us so profoundly. Leseuer let me talk on for some time, assenting in a rather constrained manner to my exclamations of enthusiasm. But it was easy to see that my companion was no longer the man who had spoken to me the day before, and that he found the subject painful. I persisted, however, until I had dragged from him a further acknowledgement of how deeply Beethoven's symphony had moved him, at which he suddenly shook his head and smiled in a curious way and said, all the same, music like that ought not to be written. Don't worry, master, I retorted. There is not much danger that it will. Poor human nature, poor master, what a world of regret, of stubborn resentment, jealousy, dread of the unknown, confession of incapacity lies behind it, and all such remarks made by countless people in similar situations. To say music like that ought not to be written, after having felt its power and being forced to recognise its beauty, is as much as to say that you yourself would never do such a thing because you know you couldn't, even if you wanted to. When people encounter great artistic work that is absolutely new and fresh and astounding, they very often react in this uncomprehending way. The thing is too immense for them. And this is why culture tends to put up with mediocrity far too often, because genius is too overwhelming. When you encounter something that you yourself couldn't do, couldn't possibly imagine, it's very threatening. It's very difficult to deal with. It's overwhelming. This is like encountering the sublime, and in effect that's what happens when you encounter Beethoven. It's just too much. It's all too much. So here's a fascinating passage in Berlioz's Memoirs where he talks about his teacher Fétis and how he altered a note in Beethoven 5. Let me read it out to you. Before I went to Italy, one of my sources of livelihood was proofreading. Among other works that the publisher gave me to read were Beethoven's symphonies, the proofs of which had already been gone through by Fétis. That's his teacher. He didn't get on with Fétis, and there was a consistent back and forth between them of snide comments about the other. I found them littered with impertinent emendations affecting the very stuff of the composer's thought, and with even more presumptuous remarks scribbled in the margin. Anything in Beethoven's harmony which did not fall in with the doctrines of Fétis had been altered with unbelievable complacency. Opposite the E flat, I'll play this on the piano in a minute, the E flat which the clarinet sustains over a chord of the sixth, D flat, F, B flat, in the andante of the C minor, Fétis had naively written, this E flat must be an F. Beethoven could not possibly have made so gross a blunder. In other words, a man like Beethoven could not possibly fail to be in entire agreement with the harmonic theories of Monsieur Fétis. Consequently, Fétis had replaced the highly characteristic E flat with an F, thereby frustrating the clear intention behind the pedal note, which does not rise to F until later, and after passing through E natural, produces a little ascending chromatic progression with crescendo of striking effect. Okay, let's try and unpack this. Right, I'm going to try and play it in Liszt's arrangement. Now Liszt, exactly the same period as Berlioz, was no less overwhelmed by his encounter with Beethoven's symphonies, and he made these wonderful piano arrangements of them, which are themselves beautiful documents of romantic worship at the feet of Beethoven. Look at the way he orchestrates for piano Beethoven's theme from the Andante. He goes, look at the hands, they're the wrong way round, so that the left hand can play the cello line. It's sort of weird, but right. Wrong, but right. Wonderful. Visionary, really, way to do it. And then the orchestra. And the woodwind. So that's Liszt's arrangement. Now, the bit that comes up in Berlioz's memoir that Fétis altered is this. So you've got the clarinet at the top, the theme's in the left hand, and there's the clarinet at the top. Now look at this. Okay, so you've got that amazing moment, which many of us will have noticed and thought, isn't that cool? But perhaps we, again, because it's so familiar, we haven't realised how amazing it is. The clarinet sitting on the E flat, and it sits there, but here, this is the bit that Fétis would have thought weird. It's still there. The harmony's now moved on to B flat minor. Why is there an E flat there? Do you see, that is weird. B flat, but it's still got the clarinet. The clarinet's still there. The clarinet's still there. Then it moves to E natural. It's revolutionary stuff, this. So Berlioz is right. It's monstrous to change it, but you can see why Fétis looked at that and thought that can't be right. So what Fétis did was he altered it. He made the clarinet do this. F. Do you see? That makes sense, doesn't it? Obviously doesn't make sense in terms of the counterpoint. Beethoven's counterpoint, this wonderful E flat, is just hanging over like a suspended thing until it rises chromatically and then goes up to the F. So in terms of this long-range line that Beethoven's got, that is clearly right. But for Fétis, who had a kind of academic's awareness of how the harmony ought to work, it wasn't right. Beethoven had got it wrong. So Fétis had naively written next to it, this E flat must be an F. Beethoven could not possibly have made so gross a blunder. I was already in a state of irritation over other similar corrections, which I need not mention here, but this exasperated me. What, I thought, bring out a French edition of the greatest instrumental works the human mind has ever created and emasculate them, make Beethoven submit to corrections like a student in a harmony class, because the publisher has had the idea of recruiting a self-opinionated professor, no more capable of advancing beyond the narrow circle of his own theories than a caged squirrel on a treadmill. Berlioz's account of Fétis and this corrected edition of Beethoven reflects on a kind of political struggle between the two, because Fétis was very hostile to Berlioz. For example, he wrote of the Symphonie Fantastique in 1835, Berlioz's masterpiece, which he composed only a year after hearing the Beethoven. Fétis wrote this: I saw that melody was antipathetic to him. This is to Berlioz, that he had only a faint notion of rhythm, that his harmony, formed by an often monstrous accretion of notes, was nevertheless flat and monotonous. In a word, I saw that he lacked melodic and harmonic ideas, and I judged that he would always write in a barbarous manner. But I saw that he had the instinct for instrumentation, and I thought that he could fulfil a useful vocation in discovering certain combinations that others would put to better use than he. So that's very funny, isn't it? And there are several similar sort of hostilities between the two, so they really hated each other. Fétis represented a more conservative musicological position, whereas Berlioz, of course, was the absolute firebrand of the avant-garde. And it's interesting that Liszt, I've just been playing from Liszt's arrangement of Beethoven, but Liszt also did an arrangement in the early 1830s of the Symphonie Fantastique. And it was that version, Liszt's arrangement of the Symphonie Fantastique, that Schumann played in the early 1830s. And that's why Schumann was able to herald Berlioz as a genius in the early 1830s. So Berlioz appealed massively to the Romantic generation, but he absolutely horrified more conservative people like Fétis. Now, if you want me to talk more about Beethoven's Fifth and its connection with the French Revolution, and there are some people, John Eliot Gardner, for example, who've suggested that it quotes from French revolutionary pieces. So I might look into that if you're really interested in that topic. But at any rate, the tumult of European music at the turn of the 19th century is a fascinating topic, isn't it? And it's fascinating to see the impact that Beethoven's music was making on the young avant-garde in the late 1820s. Really fascinating. Thank you for watching.